Over the last decade, Eastern Airlines has been at war with itself.
I live and breathe fighting management and Eastern Airlines.
Is the story of Eastern the future of corporate America?
The world has changed. The marketplace rules.
The battle for Eastern Airlines on Frontline.
Station and other public television stations nationwide, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Over the last decade, Eastern Airlines has been at war with itself.
I live and breathe fighting management and Eastern Airlines.
For a brief period, management and the unions made peace.
Everyone was working together.
But the truce was broken, and Eastern was taken over by Frank Lorenzo, who is now dismantling the airline.
The sale today is not our preferred course.
Tonight on Frontline, the battle for Eastern Airlines.
For more than 10 years, a battle has been raging at Eastern Airlines between workers and managers. On one level, the battle has engaged three men: an astronaut, a corporate raider, and a union leader, each with a different vision of how to save the company. One believed in technology, one in the power of finance, and one in the power of labor. In companies all over the country, this same battle of conflicting visions is shaping our economic future. But today at Eastern, rapidly losing passengers and money, it is a battle for survival. It is a bitter irony that only 4 years ago, labor and management at Eastern built America's most far-reaching model of workplace cooperation. The promise and the failure of that partnership at Eastern tells a story of America's economic dilemma. In the face of increasing international competition, can American workers and managers find new ways to escape their old adversarial traditions? That question has haunted Eastern Airlines, where, in the worst of times, those conflicts were known as the wars.
I live and breathe fighting management and Eastern Airlines.
I remember terminating 4 people in a day. That was how callous we were.
Wars in the sense that equipment would have a tendency to take off by itself. Engines would blow up because they didn't have oil in it.
We always thought they needed to be terminated. We felt that it was, enforcing the rules, and rules made this corporation run properly.
We sat around and looked at the engine for 8 hours. If I did an hour's work in 1981, I guess I was pushing it.
Constantly, we were at each other's throats, whether it was over a table in arbitration, whether it was over a table on a grievance, whether it was down on the floor. You know, you had to look at the culture of this corporation to know that the only success you as a person were going to find was by being the meanest, nastiest, toughest guy on the block and being successful in terms of your win-loss record and what you did.
Eastern Airlines was born in 1926 to carry mail between New York and Atlanta for $3 a pound. The World War I flying ace, Eddie Rickenbacker, bought Eastern in 1938 and ran it until 1963. Labor relations were not his strong suit. Rickenbacker was known as the captain. He referred to his workers as privates. To Rickenbacker, Eastern was a corporate army waging war on its competitors. But at Eastern, the biggest battles were waged inside the company. From 1935 to the mid-60s, Eastern endured scores of strikes and slowdowns. The company survived because of airline regulation. Until 1978, the government's Civil Aeronautics Board told airlines what routes to fly and how much they could charge. These regulated fares guaranteed management enough income to give workers regular wage increases.
If management capitulated to labor, allowed labor costs to increase, those costs would just be reflected in higher prices, regulated prices. All the airlines would have higher regulated prices. The cost would simply be passed on to consumers. And hence, an underlying labor management conflict was kept under the wraps, at least for a time.
In 1968, the world knew Frank Borman as the man who led the Apollo 8 mission around the moon.
And from the crew of Apollo 8, God bless all of you on the good earth.
Back on Earth, in 1975, Eastern Airlines Board of Directors judged Borman to have the right stuff to lead Eastern out of the darkness. Personal authority was always important to Borman. When he assumed command of the airline, Borman's nickname, earned at NASA, was the Colonel. At Eastern, he was like a field commander.
No, I don't see any 182s. There's 192.
He abolished executive perks, drove to work in a second-hand Chevy. He even helped his troops unload baggage. Borman was trained to believe in a military chain of command. Educated at West Point and the Harvard Business School, Borman was willing to share sacrifice, but not authority.
It was a simple matter of a few people at the top making all the orders, taking all the initiative, and most people at the bottom simply following directions.
As a military man, Borman believed he could handle his troops. As a NASA man, he was convinced that faith in the machine would lead to Eastern's salvation. Borman's solution was bigger and better planes. He bought 25 A300s and 27 Boeing 757s, the largest block purchase in the history of the industry. Buying the fuel-efficient planes was a gamble based on rising fuel costs, but the gamble backfired on Borman when fuel prices dropped. Soon, Eastern's debt had soared to $2.5 billion, the same price as the Apollo 8 mission to the moon.
I want as far away from the smoking as I can get.
In a regulated environment, Eastern could have passed these costs on to the consumer. But when economic conditions changed, Eastern had to lower ticket prices, even while its debt kept rising. In 1978, deregulation came to the airline industry. Over 100 new non-union carriers like People Express flew into the marketplace with low labor costs and cut-rate tickets. Older airlines, tied to high-priced union contracts, often had to fly at a loss in order to compete.
We were faced with People's Express, whose labor costs were about 40% of ours. Continental, whose labor costs were about 50% of ours. Our strategy was clear. We wanted to fix it, and that meant lowering labor costs.
When Eastern tried to compete by cutting wages, a bitter war broke out between Eastern and its three unions: the pilots, the flight attendants, and the machinists. By the early 1980s, labor and management faced the destruction of the company and the jobs of its 40,000 employees. But the response of both sides was to dig in and fight harder. In the trenches of the Miami machine shops, workers' slowdowns ate away at the company's efficiency. In response, Eastern hired reinforcements, supervisors whose only job was to watch and discipline the machinists. They hid behind two-way mirrors. They huddled inside jet engine cowlings, spying on workers with binoculars. Some mechanics struck back by sabotaging machines they were supposed to repair. When managers tried to boost output by enforcing the rules, workers fought back in the most destructive way possible. They followed the rules to the letter.
Okay, Hank, take your end toward the south. We started at 7:30. This engine is basically done as soon as the electrician gets done, right? Hour and a half. I can go in there and pull the maintenance manual out, and there's a manual in there that thick to change this engine, right? I can take 2 days to change this engine, right? So basically, that's what we were doing. I was one of the people that was more, shall we say, aggressive at it, right? Because I was protecting, in other words, I was like an old groundhog digging in his hole. I was protecting my hole.
All the planes were going out late. There was no engines coming out of the engine shop. It was a constant state of war. I really thought that was going to be the end of Eastern Airlines.
Eastern was a house divided against itself. While labor and management were busy fighting each other, competitors zeroed in on the troubled company. In 1981, Eastern lost $65 million. In 1982, $75 million. By 1983, the company's losses soared to $183 million. Only a year before, Braniff's sudden bankruptcy showed where Eastern might be headed.
It's a shock to them, I know. There is no payroll. They were taken off the payroll as of last night. The payroll, the checks that are out there now will not go through. There is no cash to support them.
Then, in September 1983, Continental Airlines, led by its tough chief executive, Frank Lorenzo, declared bankruptcy, citing high labor costs.
Our action today is to reorganize these assets in order to create a low-cost competitive carrier.
We want a contract, not a union bust.
Continental infuriated labor groups around the country when it used Chapter 11 of the Bankruptcy Code to void its high-priced union contracts. Lorenzo fired 8,000 workers and cut the wages of his remaining employees in half. 2 days later, it was Eastern's turn.
Hello, I'm Frank Borman, and I'm recording this on Sunday evening. It's a little bit past 8:30 now, almost 26 hours since Continental ceased operation.
In a videotape broadcast to Eastern employees, Frank Borman presented some grim alternatives for the troubled airline. The first was to shut the company down like Braniff.
Second course of action is to file for protection under Chapter 11 of the Bankruptcy Act, a la Continental. Say if we could continue to operate, it would certainly have to be under vastly different circumstances, as Continental employees are finding out.
Borman's third alternative was 20% pay cuts for all of Eastern's employees.
Borman's gotta go.
But after a history of angry battles over wage concessions, all three unions refused.
What happens if Borman's telling the truth and next week you're out of a job?
Borman is creating the situation. Anybody can drive a company down a tube.
And I want you to understand, with all of the honesty that I can muster in your eyes, that in my estimation, you will be voting on your jobs. Thank you very much, and God bless you all. It's like your children. You can have a genuine concern for your children. You want the best for them, but sometimes you have to ask them to do things that they really don't want to do. You can't have that extra ice cream cone, or you're going to have to go to bed when the time. It's very difficult to make those kind of decisions with a group who may not understand directly the rationale for those decisions, as you can tell a child, but your decisions in this case are filtered through an individual, i.e. a labor leader, who is more interested in keeping the children happy than he is.
Was Charlie Bryan. In 1968, while Frank Borman was orbiting the moon, Charlie Bryan was tuning jet engines on the ground as an Eastern line mechanic.
I wanted to come over and look over the operation here.
Bryan rose to power by working his way up the union hierarchy. He was elected president of the Machinists Union at Eastern in 1980 on a platform to end the wage concessions that had been going on at Eastern since 1975.
Appreciate everything everybody's doing out here.
We got the actual number of hours.
By late in 1983, Borman's call for wage cuts put Bryan in a bind. As a union leader, his job was to get more for his members, not less. But without wage cuts, Bryan knew the company would go under.
And that repeats itself. The other ones that are on.
He searched for a new solution, something he could demand in exchange for concessions.
Yesterday presented our numbers. Okay.
All my life, I have had a feeling that employees of companies are truly owners of the company that they work for. They, in the course of their labor and working for that company, they're investing their life, their intellect, and their muscle and their ability. And in exchange for that, I've always felt that there should be an ownership that goes beyond just having the job. There should be a true ownership. The company started asking the employees to voluntarily reduce wages and take pay freezes and so forth. It began in 1975. In 1980, immediately after becoming president of the union, I went to a stockholders meeting and pointed out that the employees had donated enough wages to have bought every single share of voting stock at Eastern Airlines. They could have purchased the entire corporation and completely owned 100% of their own company. And yet they had not received one single share of stock for all that investment of wages. And it was the old scenario of taxation without representation as far as we were concerned.
Late in the fall of 1983, the machinists proposed a bold new plan. Wage cuts in exchange for a financial stake in Eastern and a say in the management of the company. The plan would put the unions in a most unusual position of responsibility.
We come up with a very, very innovative, progressive plan for sharing co-determination, governance of the airline, and board positions and so forth. We presented that to Borman. It included 25% ownership of all the voting stock. His reaction to that was, I'm not going to have the monkeys running a zoo. He did not like the idea, and he rejected it.
But toward the end of the year, Borman faced the prospect of default on Eastern's loans. The airline's banks, who held the company's $2.5 billion debt, pressured Borman to accept Bryan's radical new proposal. So did Eastern's labor negotiator, former Labor Secretary William Ussery. Facing the prospect of a strike, the growing loss of consumer confidence, and possible bankruptcy or liquidation, Borman caved in. On December 13, 1983, Ussery, flanked by Bryan and Borman, announced Eastern's revolutionary labor pact. The deal was a trade, wage cuts for a stake and a say in the management of the airline. Eastern got pay cuts worth $292 million, increased productivity worth $75 million, and changes in archaic union work rules. The employees got 25% of Eastern's common stock, 4 seats on the board of directors, including one for Bryan, access to the company books, and the right to determine the way work is done. The machinists later won the opportunity to buy back their wage cuts by finding ways to save the company money. The radical worker ownership plan inspired a new marketing campaign.
You're looking at the new owners of Eastern Airlines. 37,000 employees of Eastern are now stockholders, each with a personal investment in how Eastern performs.
So we'll be working even harder.
Moving even faster.
Going even farther.
To serve you even better.
And we've got what it takes to do it. Earning our wings every day. That's not just a slogan, it's a commitment from the owners.
At Eastern, we earn our wings every day.
Eastern represented an historic first. That Eastern deal brought labor and management together as partners in enterprise. Labor and management working together to run the enterprise, not just to share the profits, but also to decide how best to make that airline work.
Many of the other business executives that I've talked to have told me flat out that they would rather have shut the company down than make the accommodation with the unions that we've made. And many of the traditional business leaders in the U.S. find this mode of management very threatening to them. I can understand why. You, in essence, surrender some of the authority to the group.
Eastern's new agreement was a complete turnabout from the company's old military tradition. At Boston's Logan Airport, Eastern eliminated all of its low-level ramp supervisors and let the workers run the field themselves.
In 1982 and some of 83, we had no say, we had no decisions to make. We weren't allowed to use our God-given brain, and it's a lot different now. People like to come to work, they like making decisions, and take, for example, today, we have no managers on today, we have no station manager, we have no shift managers. Eastern today in Boston on the day shift is run totally by the leads. We have no supervision, and apparently there's no need for it.
Time cards were abolished in Boston, and on-time attendance improved. The machinists relaxed old work rules. Ramp crews pitched in to do whatever was necessary to get the planes in and out and the baggage moved. During the wars, such commitment from workers would have been unthinkable.
We had 5 management people watching 3 Union troops unload an airplane, and it was aggravating. We felt that they didn't think we could do our job. They're always overseeing us like little kids. We run the show now, and we're doing a better job, and the company's making more money.
After the reduction in supervision, Chief Steward Leo Romano and the union assumed many management responsibilities. They helped prepare bids for charter flights, organized the shift schedules and vacations, supervised overtime, and assigned personnel to meet the flights.
Just in case.
3 years ago, I was ready to quit. I was only 39 years old at the time. I got 4 kids at home, and every day I'd come in here and I'd listen to the money problems of Eastern Airlines. They want a piece of our check and all that, you know, and the paychecks were starting to get smaller. So I talked it over with my wife, and I was actually ready to quit Eastern Airlines until these meetings with the union started taking place, and Charlie Bryan negotiated a contract where we became part of the airline itself. Instead of just a number anymore, it's my airline. I feel like anybody that almost goes to work in their own shop and stuff, it's mine. Eastern Airlines is mine. And the more I do for Eastern Airlines, the better off it is for me.
The new agreement fostered a system of shop floor entrepreneurship. Machinists could buy back their wage cuts by inventing ways to improve productivity and by ferreting out waste throughout the company. The agreement also empowered the machinists to bring any work done by outside contractors back in-house, provided they could do it more cheaply. That saved money and jobs.
But to show you one way that we were being ripped off was this little filter right here goes on an aircraft. We were paying $24 for that filter. We found that we could buy it for 2.5 cents.
The company had ideas of how to run this department, and they didn't use their best attribute, which is the mechanic. Well, now if we can show them how we save money, it was $158 a man-hour to build the CF6 engine. We're down to $78 now. And as we find new ways to do things, we can implement them automatically.
In my opinion, I've never seen the company humming like it was. I mean, the fellows were eager to work. I got 50 phone calls a day on, come over here and help me do this or figure this or show me what you want done.
For 2 years, Eastern's program of labor management cooperation was a success story. Newly motivated mechanics, executives, pilots, and flight attendants invented ways to save the company over $100 million. For the first 2 quarters of 1985, Eastern soared to the biggest profits in the company's history. By September, the airline was flying towards $73 million in the black.
I would like to sit here and say that the reason we have probably the most advanced employee involvement program in the airline, or maybe in American industry, is because both the management and union were enlightened enough to perceive this as the wave of the future. I think we have it because we were faced with the prospects of financial disaster, and this looked like a way out.
But in the fall of 1985, a new financial crisis sent Eastern into a tailspin. New fare wars forced Eastern to cut ticket prices below costs. A fourth-quarter loss of $67 million all but wiped out the profits from the rest of the year. Cooperation proved as fragile as the company's bottom line. Eastern's high debt and low-cost competition denied labor and management the time to revise their old roles.
In American industry, there is a deep cultural resistance to power sharing, not only on the part of management, but also on the part of labor. Management is used to being in control. Labor is used to taking direction. It's a little bit threatening for management to lose complete control. It's a little bit threatening for labor to have that much responsibility. These are not the roles they've inherited.
When the financial crunch came to Eastern, both sides reverted to type. Labor blamed the airline's problems on bad management. Management blamed everything on high wages.
They were obsessed with this idea of reducing the rate of pay. They would not listen to what I kept trying to say. We want to reduce labor cost and do it through productivity and efficiencies. And we proved it, we could do it. They even validated it.
a lot of labor ideas were that they would come in and be involved in making the major decisions on equipment and how you schedule the airline, how you market the airline, and so on. And of course, our idea was, well, you know, we want their cooperation, and how do you do your job better? How do we cut the costs in the workplace? But we have to have an understanding in a corporation that management has to manage. And we may have gone too far as a management in our enthusiasm to elicit the cooperation. We may have paid too high a price for it.
By early in 1986, a management consultant recommended that Eastern declare Chapter 11 bankruptcy to void its union contracts. Meanwhile, Eastern's banks, which held the airline's $2.5 billion debt, threatened to throw the company into default unless all employees agreed to 20% wage cuts by February 24th. As the deadline approached, a new player entered the game.
Toward the end of February, about the 20th, there was a board meeting, and they said they were going to look for someone to buy Eastern if they couldn't fix it through reducing and cutting wage rates and so forth. The following day, they called the labor groups together, that was on Saturday, and said that they had found a buyer, an interested buyer, and the deadline was midnight Sunday, the 23rd. We all knew that it was Lorenzo, but they had not said who it was.
Since declaring Chapter 11 at Continental, Frank Lorenzo had expanded his empire. His holding company, Texas Air, now owned both the resurgent Continental and New York Air.
Any changes at
Eastern's management had approached Lorenzo in part because the unions feared his hardball tactics. The idea, said one board member, was a pincer play to make Eastern's unions choose between wage cuts and Frank Lorenzo.
The unions call you a union buster. Do you plan to reopen all their contracts when you take over?
We're airline builders and not union busters.
On the weekend of February 21st, 1986, Eastern's board of directors met to decide the fate of the airline. On Sunday night, Eastern reached tentative accords with the pilots and the flight attendants. That left Charlie Bryan and the machinists.
At about 11:30, Borman turned to me and said, well, what are you going to do? And I said, I've made my position clear. I have told you we will save this company money, but we're not going to keep reducing our wage rates to subsidize what's going on in this corporation. He said, you're going to be the one that caused the sale of Eastern Airlines. I'm going to tell the world that you caused the sale of Eastern Airlines. And I said, well, I'm going to tell them you did it, so what does that prove? The meeting went on until about 1 o'clock in the morning, and a motion was on the floor to sell Eastern Airlines to Texas Air Corporation. That was totally unacceptable as far as I was concerned. This whole culture we had worked so hard to create was being destroyed. I went out and talked to two lawyers that we had available on the scene there to advise us and told them that, number one, I would not open our contract, but I would consider a reduction in the rates of pay by 15% more if we had the right to have a new chairman of the company which was acceptable to all the workforce, all the employees.
Well, I offered to resign. As you know, one of the machinist union's conditions were that if they would give a 15% pay cut, if indeed I would resign. And obviously I offered to do that, and the board rejected it.
They protected their chairman, and they went ahead with the sale. 4 people representing the employees voted against it. All the other board members voted for the sale of Eastern Airlines to Texas Air Corporation. It was about 2:45 on Monday morning, February the 24th.
The deal forced the sale of all of Eastern's common stock to Frank Lorenzo. The workers received $10 a share, but without stock, they lost their stake and their say in the airline. The era of cooperation was over.
I sent a very warm telegram to Frank Lorenzo the next day, suggesting that he and I meet and continue working together to produce the best product and the best service and run the company the way we knew it could be run. And he never answered that telegram. That was sent to him on the morning after the sale. He never responded.
Only a few months after the sale, Lorenzo's new management team laid off 2,000 employees and threatened 50% pay cuts. Bryan was stripped of his position on the board of directors and banned from Eastern property. In a union bulletin, he told his membership, "We're back in the midst of an all-out war."
I think management now can make a rational approach to labor, one that makes sense from the standpoint of the company. If it's not successful, they have an arsenal. They can take a strike and they can win a strike. Look at TWA. Look at the incredible stupidity of the flight attendants on TWA. The world has changed. The marketplace rules. And the American labor movement refuses to accept that. And they're going to pay a terrible price for it.
2 days after this interview, Frank Borman resigned from Eastern Airlines. Frank Lorenzo gave Borman $1 million to serve on the board of Texas Air. Borman then retreated to Las Cruces, New Mexico, to be near his son and write a book about his life.
Breed fighting management and Eastern Airlines.
For a brief period, management and the unions made peace.
Everyone was working together.
But the truce was broken, and Eastern was taken over by Frank Lorenzo, who is now dismantling the airline.
The sale today is not our preferred course.
Tonight on Frontline, the battle for Eastern Airlines.
For more than 10 years, a battle has been raging.
Management and Eastern Airlines.
I remember terminating 4 people in a day. That was how callous we were.
Was in the sense that equipment would have a tendency to take off by itself. Engines would blow up because they didn't have oil in it.
We always thought they needed to be terminated. We felt that it was, enforcing the rules, and rules made this corporation run properly.
We sat around and looked at the engine for 8 hours. If I did an hour's work in 1981, I guess I was pushing it.
Constantly, we were at each other's throats, whether it was over a table in arbitration.
At Eastern Airlines between workers and managers. On one level, the battle has engaged 3 men, an astronaut, a corporate raider, and a union leader, each with a different vision of how to save the company. One believed in technology, one in the power of finance, and one in the power of labor. In companies all over the country, this same battle of conflicting visions is shaping our economic future. But today at Eastern, rapidly losing passengers and money, it is a battle for survival. It is a bitter irony that only 4 years ago, labor and management at Eastern built America's most far-reaching model of workplace cooperation. The promise and the failure of that partnership at Eastern tells a story of America's economic dilemma. In the face of increasing international competition, can American workers and managers find new ways to escape their old adversarial traditions? That question has haunted Eastern Airlines, where, in the worst of times, those conflicts were known as the wars.
I live and breathe fight.
Over the last decade, Eastern Airlines has been at war with itself.
I live and breathe fighting management and Eastern Airlines.
Is the story of Eastern the future of corporate America?
The world has changed. The marketplace rules.
The battle for Eastern Airlines on Frontline.
Station and other public television stations nationwide, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Over the last decade, Eastern Airlines has been at war with itself.
I live and